What if the real reason you can't move on is not because you still love them? What if the real reason is something much quieter, something your mind keeps waiting for? Closure. Think about it. How many nights have you replayed the same memories in your head, the same conversations, the same moments, trying to understand what went wrong, trying to find the exact moment when everything changed? You tell yourself that if they would just explain, if they would just say one honest thing, maybe then your heart would finally be able to let go. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people leave without explanation, without apology, without giving your story the ending you hoped for, and your mind keeps searching for answers that may never come. There's a strange kind of pain that comes with certain endings. Not the loud kind, not the kind that explodes into arguments or dramatic goodbyes, but the quiet kind. The kind where someone simply fades out of your life, leaving behind a silence that feels heavier than any explanation ever could. At first, it doesn't even feel real. You tell yourself, maybe they're just busy, maybe they need space, maybe something happened that you don't know about yet. But as days slowly turn into weeks, and weeks quietly stretch into months, a different feeling begins to settle in. Confusion. Your mind starts wandering back through memories you once held with comfort. The late-night conversations, the laughter that felt effortless, the moments where everything seemed certain. You remember the way they used to look at you, the things they once promised, the plans that sounded so real when they were spoken out loud. And suddenly, those memories begin to feel different. Not warm, but puzzling. Because somewhere between those moments and now, something changed, and you don't know when. So the mind begins doing what the human mind naturally does when faced with uncertainty. It starts searching. You replay conversations in your head, you revisit the last messages you exchanged. You try to read between the lines of words that once seemed ordinary. Maybe there was a hidden meaning. Maybe there was a sign you missed. You begin asking questions that have no clear answers. Did I say something wrong? Did they stop caring before I realized it? Was there a moment when everything quietly shifted without me noticing? These questions don't arrive all at once. They appear slowly, usually at the quietest times of the day. Late at night when the world finally slows down, or during moments when something small reminds you of them. A song, a place, a memory that shows up without warning, and suddenly your mind returns to the same thought again. Why did it end like this? For most people, heartbreak isn't just about losing someone. It's about losing the explanation. We grow up believing that endings are supposed to come with clarity, that when something meaningful ends, there will be a final conversation, a moment where both people understand what happened, a moment where someone explains the truth. But real life rarely works that way. Sometimes people leave without warning, without explanation, without the kind of goodbye that gives the story a clear ending. And when that happens, something unusual begins to happen inside the mind. The brain keeps the story open. Psychologist Pauline Boss described this experience with a powerful concept known as ambiguous loss. Ambiguous loss happens when a relationship ends without clear resolution. The person may be gone from your daily life, but emotionally the story feels unfinished. There is no final answer, no moment that neatly closes the chapter. And because of that, the mind struggles to accept the ending. Human beings are natural storytellers. Our brains are constantly trying to organize experiences into clear narratives, beginning, middle, end. But when the ending is missing, the mind keeps searching for it. It replays memories, it analyzes details, it asks questions that circle endlessly without finding a conclusion. Part of you keeps hoping that one day the answer will appear. Maybe they will message you. Maybe you'll run into them somewhere unexpectedly. Maybe there will finally be a conversation that explains everything. And if that happens, you imagine something inside you will finally relax. The confusion will disappear. The questions will stop, and you will finally be able to move forward. But until that moment comes, something else quietly happens. You remain emotionally connected to the past, not because you can't move on, but because your mind is still waiting for the story to finish. This waiting can feel almost invisible. On the outside, life continues. You go to work, you talk to friends, you laugh at things that should feel normal again. But somewhere inside your thoughts, there is still a small open door, a part of your mind that hasn't fully accepted that the story might never receive the ending you hoped for. And that quiet waiting can stretch longer than we expect. Weeks become months, months become years, all because a small part of the mind is still searching for something that might never arrive. An explanation, a reason, a moment that suddenly makes everything make sense. But what most people don't realize is this. Sometimes the closure we're waiting for isn't something the other person was ever going to give us. Sometimes the story doesn't end with a final conversation. Sometimes the silence itself is the ending. And the real challenge is learning how to accept a story that never gave us the answers we were looking for. There's a moment in many heartbreaks that people rarely talk about. It's the moment when you realize there may never be an explanation. No long message suddenly arriving one night, no unexpected conversation that finally clears everything up. No moment where the other person sits down with you and says, "Here's the truth about what happened." And when that realization slowly settles in, something strange begins to happen inside the mind. You start living in a space that feels unfinished, not fully connected to the past, but not fully free from it either. It feels like standing in a doorway between two rooms, unsure which one you actually belong in. Part of you understands that the relationship has ended, but another part of you still feels like the story isn't complete. You still feel like something important was left unsaid, like a final page of the story is missing. And the human mind doesn't like missing pages. We're wired to search for meaning in everything that happens to us. When something painful happens, the brain instinctively starts asking questions. Why did this happen? What changed? Was it something I did? Sometimes the questions are gentle at first, but over time they can become louder. Your mind begins searching through the past as if the answer must be hidden somewhere. Maybe in the last conversation, maybe in the way they started responding differently, maybe in something small that didn't seem important at the time. You replay moments again and again, trying to spot the detail you might have missed, trying to understand the moment where everything shifted. But here's the difficult truth most people eventually discover. Sometimes there isn't a clear answer waiting to be found. Sometimes people leave not because of one dramatic event, but because of quiet changes that are difficult to explain, feelings that slowly fade, confusion they never learned how to talk about, or personal struggles they didn't know how to share. And when someone leaves without explaining those things, the person left behind is forced to sit with uncertainty. When someone emotionally disappears from your life without giving the story a proper conclusion, no goodbye that feels real, no explanation that helps the mind make sense of things, just silence. And silence can be incredibly confusing for the human brain, because our minds naturally want closure. We want a reason that neatly explains what happened. We want the kind of ending that helps us organize the story in our heads. But ambiguous loss doesn't offer that. Instead, it leaves people in a strange emotional space where two opposite feelings exist at the same time. Part of you knows the relationship is over, but another part of you still feels like it hasn't truly ended, because the emotional conversation never finished, because the answers never came. This is why people sometimes feel stuck after certain breakups, not because they are weak, not because they can't move on, but because their minds are still trying to complete a story that ended without warning. You might notice this in the small ways your thoughts return to the past. A random memory suddenly appears in your mind. You wonder what they're doing now. You imagine what you would say if you ever saw them again. These thoughts don't mean you're obsessed. They simply mean your mind is still trying to understand something that never fully made sense. The brain is uncomfortable with uncertainty. It prefers clear answers, even painful ones, over unanswered questions. Because when something remains unexplained, the mind keeps circling back to it, trying to solve it, trying to understand it, trying to finish the emotional loop that was left open. But the difficult reality of ambiguous loss is this: sometimes the answer you're searching for isn't available, not because you didn't look hard enough, but because the other person either couldn't explain it or chose not to. And that leaves you with a challenge that no one really prepares us for: learning to accept an ending that never gave you clarity. This is one of the hardest emotional skills a person can develop, because it requires letting go of the hope that the past will eventually make sense. It requires learning how to sit with uncertainty and slowly realizing something important: you don't actually need every answer in order to move forward. At first, that idea feels impossible. How can you let go without understanding what happened? How can you close a chapter when the final page was never written? But over time, many people begin to discover something unexpected. Healing doesn't always come from getting answers. Sometimes healing comes from accepting that the story ended, even if the explanation never arrived. And when that realization slowly begins to settle into the mind, something starts to shift. The questions become quieter, the memories lose their sharp edges, and the emotional space that once felt confusing slowly begins to open into something new. Not closure from the other person, but something deeper. The beginning of understanding that closure might have to come from somewhere else entirely. And that realization changes everything.
There's something important about the human mind that most of us never realize. Your brain doesn't just remember experiences, it tries to finish them. Every emotional experience we go through creates a kind of mental loop: a beginning, a middle, and an ending. When those three pieces exist, the mind can slowly place the memory into the past. It becomes a chapter that has already been written. But when the ending is missing, something different happens. The loop stays open, and an open emotional loop has a strange effect on the mind. It keeps returning, sometimes quietly, sometimes when you least expect it. You could be having a completely normal day, talking to someone, working, laughing at something small, and suddenly a memory appears. A conversation from the past, a moment that once felt meaningful, or a question that still doesn't have an answer. For a few seconds, your mind travels back there again, not because you wanted to, but because your brain is still trying to complete the loop. Psychologists have long studied this tendency of the mind to remember unfinished experiences more strongly than finished ones. One famous explanation of this was described by psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who observed something fascinating about human memory. People remember unfinished tasks far more easily than completed ones. When something is left incomplete, the brain keeps holding on to it, almost like a reminder, a quiet signal that says, "This story isn't finished yet." This effect doesn't only happen with tasks, it also happens with relationships. When a relationship ends clearly, even if the ending is painful, the mind eventually begins to accept it. There was a conversation, a goodbye, a moment that explained what happened. But when a relationship ends without clarity, the brain struggles to categorize it. It doesn't know where to place the memory, so instead of closing the chapter, it keeps reopening it. This is why certain thoughts return again and again. The mind keeps asking questions. What really happened? Did they ever care the way I thought they did? Was there something I missed? The brain believes that if it can just understand the story, the emotional tension will finally relax. So it keeps searching, replaying moments, reanalyzing conversations, looking for meaning in details that once felt ordinary. But this search can easily turn into something exhausting because the brain is trying to solve a puzzle that may never have had a clear solution. And every time the mind returns to the past, it briefly opens the emotional loop again. For a moment, the memory feels fresh, the feelings return, the questions come back. Then the mind eventually moves on to something else, until the loop opens again another day. This cycle can make people feel like they are stuck, like they should have moved on by now, like something must be wrong with them for still thinking about it. But the truth is much simpler. The brain is just doing what it was designed to do. It's trying to complete the story. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We naturally want experiences to make sense. We want the emotional events in our lives to have a clear structure. But life doesn't always cooperate with that desire. Some stories end mid-sentence. Some relationships fade quietly instead of ending with explanation. And when that happens, the mind struggles to place the experience in the past, because without an ending, the brain treats the memory as unfinished. And unfinished things tend to stay alive inside the mind. But here's something interesting. Over time, many people slowly begin to notice a shift. The loops don't disappear immediately, but they begin to lose their intensity. The questions that once felt urgent slowly become quieter. The memories appear less frequently, not because the mind finally received the answers it was looking for, but because something deeper started to change. The brain begins to realize that searching for the missing explanation isn't actually helping anymore. At some point, the emotional energy that once fueled the search begins to fade. And when that happens, the mind slowly starts letting go of the need to solve the puzzle. Not at all once, but gradually. This is the moment where healing quietly begins. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic realization. It usually appears in small, almost unnoticeable ways. A day passes where you don't think about the past at all. Then another. Then one day you remember the story again, but it doesn't feel as heavy as it once did. The emotional loop that once felt impossible to close slowly begins to loosen. And this is where an important realization begins to form. Maybe closure was never about getting the answers. Maybe closure was about something else entirely, something the mind slowly learns over time. The understanding that not every story in life will give us the ending we hoped for. But that doesn't mean the story has to control us forever. And once the brain begins to accept that idea, something powerful happens. The loop that once felt endless finally begins to close on its own. Not because someone returned to finish the story, but because you slowly stopped waiting for them to.
At some point in every unresolved heartbreak, a quiet realization begins to appear. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly. It usually arrives after months of questions, after nights of replaying the past, after your mind grows tired of searching for answers that never came. One day, a small thought begins to form. Maybe the explanation I've been waiting for isn't coming. And strangely, that realization can feel both painful and freeing at the same time. Painful because a part of you finally understands that the conversation you imagined may never happen. But freeing because another part of you begins to realize something important. Your healing was never supposed to depend on someone else returning to finish the story. For a long time, many of us believe closure is something another person gives us. We imagine it as a final conversation, a moment where the truth is revealed, a moment where everything suddenly makes sense. But life rarely offers that kind of ending. People leave, stories stop in the middle, and sometimes the person who could have explained everything chooses silence instead. For a long time, that silence can feel unbearable. But over time, something begins to shift. You start noticing that the questions don't appear as often as they once did. The memories still exist, but they no longer pull you back with the same intensity, and the emotional space that once felt confusing begins to feel quieter. Not empty, just calmer. This is the moment where a different kind of understanding begins to grow. The realization that closure might not come from answers. It might come from acceptance. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl once wrote that human beings are capable of finding meaning even in situations that make no sense, not by changing the past, but by changing how they relate to it. And this idea quietly transforms the way we think about closure, because closure isn't really about solving the mystery of what happened. It's about deciding that the story no longer needs to control the present.
At first, this decision feels small, almost invisible. You stop checking whether they viewed your stories. You stop imagining conversations that will probably never happen. You stop waiting for the message that once felt so important. Instead, your attention slowly returns to something that was always there, your own life, the people still around you, the moments still unfolding in front of you. And something surprising happens when that shift begins. The past slowly loosens its grip, not because it suddenly makes sense, but because you no longer need it to. You begin to understand something that takes many people years to realize. Closure is not a gift someone else gives you. It's a decision you quietly make for yourself. A decision that says, I may never fully understand what happened, but I'm no longer going to pause my life waiting for an explanation. This kind of closure is quiet. There is no dramatic moment where everything suddenly changes. It usually happens in small ways. One day, you realize you went an entire week without thinking about the past. Another day, you hear the song that once reminded you of them, and it simply sounds like music again. Eventually, the story becomes just that. A story. Something that once mattered deeply. Something that shaped a chapter of your life, but not something that defines the rest of it. And that's when the final shift happens. You stop seeing the relationship only as something that ended. You start seeing it as something that existed. A chapter that had meaning while it lasted. Even if it didn't last forever. Even if the ending never arrived the way you hoped. Every relationship leaves something behind. Lessons about love. Lessons about boundaries. Lessons about what you need and what you deserve. And when you look back from a distance, those lessons begin to matter more than the unanswered questions ever did. Because the truth is, closure was never really about them. It was always about you. About the moment you realize that your story continues, with or without their explanation. The moment you stop waiting for the past to give you permission to move forward. And instead, you quietly give yourself that permission. When that moment arrives, something unexpected happens. The emotional loop that once kept pulling you backward finally begins to close. Not because someone returned to explain everything, but because you stopped needing them to. And in that quiet realization, you discover a kind of freedom that no conversation could have given you. The freedom to continue your story. Not with bitterness, not with regret, but with the understanding that some endings are incomplete, and life continues beautifully anyway. And maybe that's the real meaning of closure. Not finding the perfect ending, but realizing that your life was never meant to stop at that chapter.